Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm just repeating for the recording that in honor of Mother's Day, by divine providence, it turns out that we're reading about, we're starting to read a new parsha called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, the very first mother. And it must be that it's connected to Mother's Day, right? Must be, no other way of explaining it. It's actually interesting that Sarah is the first, I would say, I think that I can remember the only woman in the 5 books of Moses that the Torah goes into great detail and tells us the exact amount of time that she lived. It's very interesting, very unique, because usually when the Torah tells us how long the men lived, it's not that we're too interested in the men, it's just that we want to know the Torah is telling us something about the chronology. In other words, that's how they understood the passage of time, what generation you are. So by counting, for example, Adam's, the life of the different men that are mentioned in the Torah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you can figure out the events, when the events occurred. But the woman, we're not here to tell you how long Avram lived. So with the woman, not everybody knew their age. Not everyone knew how long they lived. It wasn't like, it was much more modest. So not everybody knew about their life. So that wouldn't be an efficient way of telling time. So when the Torah does tell you about the life of Sarah, it's significant. And this is not just to tell us about the passage of time, but it's to tell us about Sarah herself. So that's very interesting. So in some sense, you could say, well, how come the Torah spends more time telling you about the years of the men and only once about the women? But I would counter and say, when the Torah tells you about how long a man lived, it's not really for the man. It's just to tell us about the period of time. When the Torah does tell us about Sarah, how long she lived, it's because it's telling us something unique about her. So that's by way of introduction. It's actually, there's a lot to talk about here, even before we get to the actual plot, even just the name of the parsha. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 23. If you have the article, it's 107. The name of the parsha, Parshat Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, which is a very strange name to name a parsha, which discusses and begins with the passing of Sarah. So that's something to talk about. I'm just going to share the screen for a moment. Here's the opening verse, page 107 in the article or on the screen, Genesis chapter 23. They translate this, depending which translation you read. I'm going to read from the screen. And the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So we named the parsha the life of Sarah because that's the opening phrase. But if you think about it, verse 2 tells you the context of what we're talking about. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and bewail her. And the rest of the parsha essentially is talking about, at least the rest of this story is the burial of Sarah. And then we move on, talk about not Sarah, but finding a wife for Sarah, finding a wife for Isaac, finding Rebecca. So it's strange that the entire parsha would be called the life of Sarah. So that's one thing to contemplate. Another thing to contemplate is why it says the years. It's sort of repetitive. It was the life of Sarah, 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. You could just say 127 years, right? It says years multiple times, 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. Sounds like each one is its own unit. So that's just sort of a drawn out way of saying the verse, so that we want to address that as well. And then at the end of the verse is also repetitive. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Yeah, I know that. We said that at the beginning of the verse. And the life of Sarah was. So why the repetitiveness of this verse? First of all, mentioning Shana, mentioning year 3 times. And also the end of the verse, we would be perfectly fine without the end of the verse, the years of the life of Sarah, because the verse itself says, and the life of Sarah, if the verse said, and the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, we would know everything we need to know. There would be no problem. So that's some of the questions. And again, questions are only really invitations to dig a little deeper. So where do we want to start from? Go ahead, Bob.
Just to get this out of the way, Rabbi, I mean,
Yes.
I think in the whole 5 books, there are six parshiot with the names of people, whether it be Korach or Yitro or Balak or whatever.
Yeah.
How does Chabad weigh in on why these six parshiot were named for people?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know if we focus exclusively on the name of people, but we do say that the name of the parsha is not just a convenient way. So we're going to take the first unique phrase of the verse and name that as a parsha. We don't say that. We say, right, because for example, otherwise you could say this parsha is very simple. It's called Chayei Sarah because it's not word 2 and word 3 of the parsha. And we'll name the parsha, even though the theme of the parsha is not the life of Sarah, it's the death of Sarah. But we don't say that. We reject that notion. Why do we reject that notion? So what's the proof? So the proof is a very interesting proof. The proof is that the second parsha of the Torah is called Noach. What's the first word? Eile Toldot Noach. These are the descendants or the chronicles or the children, call it what you want, the children. These are the children of Noach. Eile Toldot Noach. We call the parsha Noach. You go a few parshas down, Lech Lecha Vayera, Chayei Sarah. Next parsha, not the parsha we're starting now, but the next one is called Toldot, the descendants. And the verse starts the same way. Eile Toldot Yitzchak. These are the descendants of Isaac. So we have two portions. One portion is these are the descendants of Noach. The second one, these are the descendants of Isaac. Now, why is it, same phrase, why is it that the parsha of Toldot is not called Yitzchak? Now, you could say, you would think that the first word available, the first unique word available should be the name. If that's the case, then Noach should be called Toldot. And Toldot should not be called Toldot. Toldot should be called Yitzchak, right? So from the fact that you see the Torah is careful and the Torah does not necessarily take the first unique word. But the custom is that at least for 1,000 years, maybe even more, that we name the parsha for not necessarily the first unique word, tells you that the theme is supposed to be the theme of the entire parsha. Now, what you mentioned, Bob, is about other names like Korach. So we have to analyze each of those. Korach is probably the biggest problem. Korach, Balak, but Korach is a very big problem. Why are we naming the parsha for a person who is less than righteous? So yes, the short answer is that we name the parsha because that somehow captures the theme of the entire parsha. Let me give you. Should I give you an example? I'll give you an example from this week's parsha. This week's parsha has 3 stories. I mean, not the one we're reading, the one we're going to read this week in the synagogue. Talks about the priests. It talks about the holidays. And the end is a very strange parsha. There's only 2 episodes in the book of Leviticus, very short episodes. So there's very little plot, but there's 2 pieces of plot in the book of Leviticus. One, as we read earlier, the death of the sons of Aaron. And the second one is the end of this week's parsha, which is very tragic or sad or barbaric. Someone curses God and he's put to death. What's the name of the parsha? Emor, speak or talk. Why is that the name of the parsha that talks about the laws of the priests and the laws of the holidays? So the Hasidic commentary says the only unique theme of all these 3 stories in the parsha is speech. Because with the priest, it's not so much about the priest, but like Rashi talks about, it's how the priests have to educate. How do you educate? Through speech. How do you sanctify the holidays? Through speech. You have to declare it. That's the law. You have to, the Beis Din has to declare it holy, mikudash, holy. The power of the Jewish court to imply sanctification to time is tied to speech. And finally, the third story is the blasphemy, cursing God, represents in the negative of the power of speech, abusing the power of speech. Speech is not insignificant. Speech has power, and therefore, without getting into that story, and therefore, using speech in a negative way has negative consequences. So here you see 3 stories, 3 themes. It seems unrelated, and the name of the parsha seems just a technicality because it's Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemer. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, "Emor al Kohanim, speak to the priests." So that's an introductory verse. No, it's not an introductory verse. The whole theme of the parsha is really about speech. So that's case in point, where we look at it, where the word may seem to be just a technicality, but if you think about it, there's no other word that will bind all 3 stories other than what we thought initially was just a technicality. So that's That's what we have to do. So we're going to have to do the same thing in this week's Parsha. Think about how burying Sarah, finding a bride for Isaac, and ultimately burying Abraham, how that itself is the life of Sarah, as opposed to what she did during her lifetime. So that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. So Jill, did you raise your hand? I don't know if you withdrew the question or you.
Yes, well, it was just a comment, but I've made it before that sometimes the language is we have to remember that not everybody was reading it. It was probably oral, and a lot of the form had to do with how you transmit it, how people heard it, rather than the specific way in which it says 100 years. It's very poetic to put it in that form.
It is.
And this is a verbal, this is an oral form originally.
Originally, it could be an oral form, but by the time Moses writes it, but at that time it becomes part of the written Torah, and then it was chosen. Even if it was an oral form before, it becomes established as the written form as well. So you could say poetry. That's fine. But the sages address it. That's why I'm addressing it. They say there's a significance. 100 is its own thing. 7 is its own thing. 20 is its own thing, and that's. So we'll address that. But you're right. It's also poetry. I'm not taking that away. Okay, let's start with the basics. This is something that the Rebbe would always talk about. Life of Sarah is after Sarah's passing. How do you know someone's life? How do you determine someone's life? How do you define somebody's life? What's the test if they were alive, or the test of their values, the values they lived? In some sense, you can see it more after the person's lifetime than during their lifetime. Because after their lifetime, what they're able to transmit to others, what they're able to transmit to their children, for example, or to others, in some sense, that's when you see the impact of their legacy, and it becomes everlasting. So in some sense, the life of somebody, the true life, the enduring life, is not necessarily visible in their lifetime, because in their lifetime you say, yeah, the person's engaged in this behavior, but is that really going to endure? Is that going to last, or is that just temporary, just as entertainment, right? After a person passes, you look around to their children, you look to their legacy, and you see what survives their legacy, and then you see the life of Sarah, then you see the true life, because the true life is not temporary, true life is permanent. And if you think about that, what we're going to see is that all the stories of this parsha emphasize Sarah's life, Sarah's values, even more than Abraham's values. So even though in this parsha, Sarah does nothing, she's completely passive. Abraham does all the work. First, Abraham does a tremendous amount of negotiation, real estate negotiation. The first parcel of real estate is purchased for Sarah's burial spot. So Abraham is very active. And then Abraham empowers Eliezer to find a wife for Rebecca, and Eliezer is the one who's active. And later we read about the burial of Abraham through Isaac and Ishmael. Sarah is not active in this parsha at all, but this actually expresses the life of Sarah. Why? Because this parsha, every line in this parsha expresses the values of Sarah. And that's what you say. Her legacy was alive. During her lifetime, you weren't sure, because as we'll see in a minute, there's two streaks in the family. There's Abraham's pulling in one way, Sarah's pulling in another way. There's a certain tension between the two. And only after her life do you see that Abraham is sort of expanding her legacy and cementing her legacy. And that's why life of Sarah, you see it after her life. So just to do this very briefly, because we touched upon this in the previous parshas, there's a certain tension between Abraham's mission and Sarah's mission. Abraham's mission is universal. We discussed this last week as well, but we discussed this in other times. God changes Abraham's name from Avram, father of Ram, which means father of Aram, or father of the abstract father. In other words, the one who comes up with, he has a wisdom, abstract ideas, and God changes his name to Av Hamon Goyim, father of many multitude of nations. Abraham's mission is universal, no question about that. And that's what he does. In his lifetime, he's also engaged with the culture around him, and he also has multiple children, and he was very much connected emotionally to his other sons. First Yishmael, and later we'll read about the other sons that he has. He remarries Keturah, which may be Hagar, but that's another story. But Abraham has many children, and he's interested in influencing many cultures. That's Abraham. Sarah, is her unique contribution is to create the specific Jewish nation. In other words, the uniqueness to cultivate a unique nation that obviously has a universal message that is supposed to impact the rest of the world, but is nevertheless unique and distinct and separate. That's Sarah. And where did we see this play this out in the most harsh way, most obvious way, where Abraham doesn't want to send away his son Ishmael, and Sarah says we have to send him away because he is interfering with the uniqueness of Isaac. He is influencing Isaac negatively, and her job is not a mother that has to worry about all her children. Her job is to worry about her only child, and she only had one child because that was her spiritual mission, to cultivate the Jewish people specifically. So that's the tension between Abraham and Sarah. Who's right? They're both right. They each have a unique mission. What does this parsha highlight? This parsha highlights, all the stories of this parsha highlight the uniqueness of the Jewish people. The uniqueness of the Jewish people is the message of Sarah even more than the message of Abraham. Where do you see this? So first of all, you see that Abraham is buying a burial spot specifically for Sarah and her descendants. That's the cave of Machpelah. And he's specifically buying it in the land of Israel because the land of Israel is going to be the place of the Jewish people. So the theme of negotiating to buy a burial plot, we don't see this about his other wife. He doesn't do that for Hagar. So it's the uniqueness of Abraham, of Sarah, of the Jewish people, Sarah and the Jewish people. Then you have the next story. The bulk of the parsha is Abraham sending away his servant to find a wife for Isaac. But he has to send her hundreds of kilometers away across the desert back to Iraq. Why can't he just take a local girl? I'm sure there were plenty of girls that were good looking. So the answer is that Abraham says that she wants to take someone specifically from his family for the kindness that his family possessed. We don't see Abraham having that concern for Yishmael. Yishmael married local girls, all kinds of them, all different girls. He had a few wives. And again, so Abraham is saying for Isaac, who is unique, for the Jewish people who is unique, we need to go find a unique type of girl, one that has a tremendous amount of kindness. Again, so the bulk of the parsha is the uniqueness of Isaac even over Yishmael. And the final short portion, but very significant portion, is Abraham passes away. And the verse says that Isaac and Yishmael buried Abraham. Isaac and then Yishmael. Says Rashi, quotes the sages. Why did it say Isaac first? Yishmael is older. So that tells us, say the sages, that Yishmael repented. What was his sin? His sin that he thought that he was the primary son. When at the funeral, he lets Isaac go first. Then he understands that Isaac has a unique place in the legacy of Abraham. So all those stories, the three basic stories, highlight the legacy of Sarah over the legacy of Abraham. And therefore, yes, this is the story of the life of Sarah. This is the legacy of Sarah because her legacy now continues and is enduring. And you don't always see that during the person's lifetime, because during the lifetime, you don't know if their legacy, if they will have an enduring legacy and what part of the legacy would be enduring. So that's why specifically after the passing, do you say Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. And this is something that's a very powerful theme, and the Rebbe would always come back to it. Because in Judaism, life is everlasting and enduring. And to the extent, the parts of our life that are enduring are our true life, our true self. So that's introduction number one, just about the term, the life of Sarah, and why the Parsha is named the life of Sarah, if most of the Parsha, all the Parsha is talking about after her passing, and matters that actually don't express life. Burial is not life, and we shift the focus to other people. No, but shifting that focus is her legacy because it expresses her legacy, which is the uniqueness of the Jewish people. So that is, I guess, first step of our journey. Okay. They're davening, so there's noise, but they're praising God. How bad could that be? Okay, what do you do with the shana, with the years? It says year every single time. Could have said 127 years, and it says 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. So the sages give an interpretation. So I'm going to read what the sages say. And then I'm going to try to explain it. Well, I don't know what the sages. Yeah, okay. I'm going to look at the Rashi. I'm going to read the Rashi. Here they have a Chizkuni. They don't really bring Rashi. Rashi is not fully spelled out, but we're going to read the Rashi, and then we'll try to offer it in simpler language. So here we go. This is the first Rashi. And the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. Rashi quotes the Medrash, Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah. The reason that the word years were written after every digit is to tell you that every digit is to be expounded upon individually. When she was 100 years old, she was like 20-year-old regarding sin. Just as a 20-year-old has not sinned because she is not liable for punishment, so too when she was 100 years old, she was without sin. And when she was 20, she was like a 7-year-old as regards to beauty, from Genesis Rabbah. So you may have heard that a person is not responsible for their sin until they're 12 or 13. That is correct. But there's another less famous idea, and that's consistent with modern science, which says that the brain is not fully developed until after the person's until at least 20 or 22. I don't know what they're saying nowadays, but certainly not at 13 or 12. And that's why in the Torah, when we say a person is liable at 12 or 13, that's liable to Hashem. But the human court would not punish until the person is 20. It's interesting. So a person would murder before 20, they wouldn't be put to death because the human court cannot punish before 20. So that's why the Medrash says, look, 127. Look at each one separately. When she was 100, she was like 20 in regards for sin. She was complete without sin. When she was 20, she was like 7 without beauty, for beauty. Just as beautiful as 7. Okay, what is it really telling us? Or how do I say this in other words? So other later commentators are saying it in other words, and I'll try to say it. I think it's just a little bit easier to understand what they're saying. So every area of life, every period of life, person has its own qualities, right? So you have childhood, certain qualities. The teenage years, a person's growing up, certain qualities. And then when a person is an adult, they have certain qualities, wisdom or whatever it may be. Now, what happens usually is we move from one set of qualities to the next. Maybe when we're young, we're innocent. Maybe when we're a teenager, we have a little bit more rebellion, or in the positive sense, we're more curious. And maybe later we become wiser. Whatever the case is, we move from one set of years to another set of years. Then you'd say a person's 127. They went through the spectrum of life. But if you say the person at 127, she's not 127. She is 7, and she's 20, and she's 100. What does that tell you? That tells you that even when she's later in life, she still maintains the qualities of the early period of life. She doesn't transform as much as grow, but still maintain the quality from the earlier of life. So a person at 100 could be youthful in the sense curious like a child. A person could be innocent like a child, but not when they get some wisdom, they lose the innocence. You can get the wisdom and still maintain the innocence, right? So that's the difference. If I say I'm 127, means I accumulated many different experiences, but that I preserve those early experiences even when I'm later in life. And that's what the sages are saying. When she's 100, she's sinless like 20, but now she's got the wisdom. Now she has the opportunity to sin, or now she loses some of that innocence. Yeah, but she can maintain the 20 at 100. She can maintain the 7 at 20 and at 100. So that's what we're saying. We're saying when a person travels through life, it's not that I'm changing and abandoning the old experiences for the new one. I want to preserve the old experiences and add that to my current personality. So I'm not 127. I'm 100, I'm 20, and I'm 7. Right. So in the modern sense, we say person should always maintain their youth, their sense of the child, the inner child. Right. So that would be the way we say it. We say, you're not a child anymore, but could you preserve some of those blessings of childhood that usually are lost when a person matures and finds other qualities? Because those qualities could be have different emphasis, right? When a person is young, they're curious, and a person is wise and attains a certain degree of knowledge, so they're much more settled in their way. They're not here to disrupt as much as the child is, because the child wants to always learn something new and doesn't want to sit still. So the question is, can I maintain the previous quality while I still have the new, different quality? And the answer is that's the way we're supposed to live. I'm not 127 years old. I'm 100, and I'm 20, and I'm 7. So that's why Shana is mentioned all the times. And to Jill's point, if you go back to the beginning of Genesis, where you have the Genesis chapter 5. Is it Genesis? Yeah, is it you'll see it in Genesis chapter 5, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Genesis chapter 5. So to Jill's point, Jill says that, well, it's also poetic and it's also easier to remember. That is correct. But if you go back to the first time the Torah gives the chronology of people, it doesn't say Shana every time. It doesn't say year every time. In fact, it would say, for example, actually it does say it at Adam. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it does say it. I'm sorry? 130 years, right. So this is interesting. So let's try to figure this out. Verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years. Shloshim machana. So it combines the 30 and 100. But that's not the rest of his life. That's not his whole life. When you get to the rest of the life, it says 900 years. Verse 5, 900 years, 900 900 years and 30 years. So that would be consistent with the style over here. Let me see if there's a case where it doesn't do that. Seems like it's doing this for most people. Okay, for example, verse 17. No, that's verse 17. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years. So it says Chamesh v'tishim shana. Oh, this is what's doing. Okay, I'm sorry. What happens in Genesis is that it will separate the 100 and the smaller number. So you'll have 100 years and 72 years. That you'll have. But you won't have 100 years, 70 years, 2 years. That you won't have. You'll have 2 shanas, you won't have 3. And the sages point out that the only time you'll have 3 with each digit, in other words, the hundreds and the tens and the singles will have a different shana. That's only for a righteous person. So the other ones, it's going to say 100 years, 75, 100 years, 70, 100 years, 72 years, 195. But it won't say 195, right? So if you see, right, unless I'm being, I think that's the deal. I may be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sharing the screen again, right? So for example, verse 20, Yared, I'm sure he's a nice guy. And all the days of Yared were 962 years. So how does it explain it? Shtayim v'shishim shana, 2 and 60 years, and 900 years, and they died, right? So that's what it seems, that's the pattern. Right, Chanoch, verse 23, and all the days of Enoch were 365 years. So Chamesh v'shishim shana, 560 years, 65 years, and 300 years, etc. Yeah, so that's the pattern. That's the pattern. The pattern is that you'll usually get 2. You'll have 100. The 100 will get a years, and the other set, whatever, the less than 100 will be combined. Here with the righteous, you get 100. You get the hundreds gets its own year. The tens get their own year, and the single digits get their own year. So that's what it is. Okay, why did she die right now? This story is written right after the story of the binding of Isaac. So there's a very sad medrash. Very sad medrash. It's very troubled, very sad. I found another commentator that said the opposite, made it a happy story. And I was very happy to read that. But then he says, yeah, that's the way I read it. But we have the tradition from the sages, so let's follow the sages. I would say, come on. Couldn't you give me an opportunity to read the positive story? Okay, so I'll do both. I'll read the Rashi who quotes the Medrash, which says that this is very sad. Then I'll tell you what the Tzor Hamor says, who says that it's happy. But then he says, look, we have a tradition. We're not going to argue with the tradition. I say, please, you give me another perspective, But okay, here we go. So let's find again, Genesis chapter 20, I think we're 23. Let's open up some Rashi here. Okay. To eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. That's verse 2. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. To eulogize Sarah and to bewail her, says Rashi, the account of Sarah's demise was juxtaposed to the binding of Isaac, because a result of the news of the binding that her son was prepared for slaughter and was almost slaughtered, his soul flew out of her and she died, from Genesis Rabbah. So the Medrash says, all of a sudden, right after the binding of Isaac, you hear about the passing. You know why? Because the news, the shock of the fact that her son was almost killed caused her to die. It's a very sad Medrash. Some people try to sweeten this that say it wasn't sadness, it was joy. Because the Medrash says, if you look at the exact Hebrew language, kimat shelo nishchat, almost he wasn't killed. So in biblical Hebrew, you can do it, but if you do it literally, he was almost not killed. In other words, the news was that she was not killed, not that he was almost killed. Kimat shelo nishchat. So you can spin this and say, well, she was very happy. Either way, that's the negative way. Like I'm reporting that a few weeks ago, I found that Tzor Hamor, who was a Kabbalistic commentator, a student of the Arizal, and he says like this, no, it's a wonderful story. It's telling you that Sarah lived a full life. She saw the binding of Isaac, saw her son being prepared to devote to God. She also got the email, which we read about last week, that Rebecca was born. So she also understands that there's a prospective wife for her son. And now everything is fine, full circle. She has continuance. Her son is going to be able to get married. And that's what the Torah is trying to highlight. And the reason why I like this interpretation because the binding of Isaac is written, the story of Sarah is juxtaposed, the death of Sarah is juxtaposed not to the binding of Isaac, but to the story right after the binding of Isaac, which is the news that Rebecca was born. And obviously Rebecca, the Torah is telling us to, so in other words, the recipients of this news understood that Rebecca would be a potential wife for Isaac. So in that sense, if you want to really be technical, it was juxtaposed to the story of Rebecca, which would be positive. But I can only follow what the Tzor Hamor says, and he says we have to accept the Kabbalah, the tradition of the sages. So if he's doing that, I'm just reporting, but I'm just putting it out there. You don't have to read this in a negative light. Okay, fine. Oh, I missed one point here. Why? One of the questions we asked last week, we asked in the beginning, is going back to verse. So I think we dealt with this verse pretty well, pretty comprehensively, right? We said, verse 1, the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. So we explained why you need years at every single one. And like we figured out that usually the Torah would say years twice. Here it says years 3 times, okay? And then the last question we had, what does it say? The years of the life of Sarah. Why do I need this last phrase? Shnei Chayei Sarah, the years of the life of Sarah. Just say in the beginning, and the life of Sarah was, we know 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. The years of the life of Sarah. So there are various interpretations. One interpretation this morning that I read from the Kli Yakar was as follows. It doesn't say the life of Sarah. In the beginning of the sentence, it says the life of Sarah was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. So you would expect the end to be in the same form. The years, this was the life of Sarah. But he has to say, no, the years of the life of Sarah. So what the Kli Yakar says, he says like this, the years of the life of Sarah is not the life of Sarah. Life of Sarah is the spiritual life, which continues after life on this earth. The years of the life of Sarah means the 127 were the years of the life when she was in this world, subject to time and space. So part of Sarah's life is the years of the life of Sarah. But by no means is 127 years define the life of Sarah. All it does is defines the years of the life of Sarah. The life of Sarah goes beyond these years because the life of Sarah is eternal because the soul is immortal. So all that's alluded to by that extra word, Shnei Chayei Sarah, the years of the life of Sarah. In other words, this is not the life of Sarah. This is the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah's life continues even after the years. So I thought that was an interesting interesting subtlety. Okay, the fun continues. The verse continues. It's a sad verse, but there's a lot of insight here. Tremendous amount of insight here. So if you look at verse 2, which we read already, kids are very excited to pray. So God likes to hear the voice. I'm not going to be the one to disturb. Okay. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So let's focus on the last phrase, second half of the phrase. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and bewail her. So cry for her. So you have eulogy first and bewailing and crying separately. That's one issue. The other issue is that in the Torah, if you have the art scroll, you could see it on page 106, line number 3, the second to last word. In the Torah, the word livkota, to bewail her, is written with a small kaf. This letter that I'm highlighting on the right side, livkota, is a small kaf. Let's see if I could show it to you on the screen. See if you could see this. I don't know. I don't know if you could see it. I don't know if you could see it. Bottom line is, for this, you could trust me because you can, if I'm saying something untrue, Vicky will speak up because you have the book I see, right? So leave kota, third line on page 106, is a small kaf. So there's eulogy, there's bewailing. Bewailing has a small letter in the Torah, and it's significant. If you write it with a regular size letter, the Torah is not kosher, right? So it's significant. The font size in the Torah must be precise. But another detail of the grammar here, it should have said, why is Sarah's name in between eulogizing and bewailing, right? It could have said, and Abraham came to eulogize and bewail Sarah, right? It says, no, to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. But the bewail doesn't say her name. It just says her. So you could say, well, that's a style of writing. But as you will see, there's commentators who say, no, this is very significant. Now, before we even get to the subtlety, let's think about the eulogy and bewailing and crying. This is very surprising. Why? Because if you look at the Jewish law and you look at the Mishnah says that everybody knows that in Judaism, the mourning starts very intense and then diminishes, and we're supposed to diminish it. In other words, on one hand, you have to mourn. There's a mitzvah to mourn. On one hand, actually, I think it was in some sense, I think it was last week's parsha also that highlights this point. You cannot have excessive mourning, because if a person mourns excessively, there's a lot of problems with excessive mourning. It means they're not accepting God's decree or God's decree of the cycle of life, and also they're not believing in some sense, they're not believing in the afterlife. In other words, the fact that the soul is immortal. So if the mourning is too intense, and that's what the pagans would mourn intensely, and they would tear their garment, tear their skin, and make tattoos, do all kinds of things to sort of make the mourning permanent. And in yesterday's parsha, Kadoshim to you, you are holy. We have to be holy. Part of being holy is the opposite. Let's see if I can find it, unless I'm totally dreaming, which is possible. Yeah, right here. If you look at this yesterday's parsha, page 665, we read about B'seret l'nefesh. We say, verse 28, you shall not make a cut in your flesh for the dead, because that's what they would do. That's what the idol worshippers would do. So they would tear their skin as a sign of mourning, which is excessive mourning. We say, do not mourn excessively. Why not? If you mourn excessively, what you're doing is you're saying that you're not accepting the fact that the soul is immortal. It's like it's the end of the road. But what happens if the soul in heaven, actually, after the first period of mourning, the soul is actually finds joy? And then if we continue mourning, that diminishes the mourning of the joy of the soul. So in some sense, so that's why Judaism on one hand says you have to mourn, but nevertheless, the mourning is diminished. Now, how is the mourning diminished? So we know there's Shiva, 7 days, and then there's Shloshim, 30 days, and then there's the full year. Okay. But what's less known, but it's in the Mishnah, is that within the 7 days, the Mishnah says, Shlosha lebchi. the first 3 days is a time for crying. And then the 4, after the 3-4, is a time for eulogy. In other words, before you can eulogize is talking about the person's life and the person's values and how to learn from their values. That's wonderful. That's part of the Shiva process. It's not about just crying. It's about helping the person, the soul, the deceased live on by internalizing their life. And that's what the eulogy is. But before the eulogy, there has to be crying.
But here it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. Exact opposite of the Mishnah. So that's why it's so surprising that it's separate with Sarah's name in between. And like Bob says, the opposite of what the Mishnah says, the opposite of what we're going to do. So this is all of a sudden, this is a red flag. All the sages go, all the commentaries have to deal with this, at least some of them, because it's the opposite of what our custom is. Okay, so I'm quoting from the Kli Yakar, but he gives all kinds of interpretations. He's a few lines long, and some are positive, some are negative. In other words, some are sad, some are happy. He said it's a dance here, so it's up to you what you want to read, what you want to take away from this. But I'm going to give a few. He gives at least 2 interpretations that are sort of a different style, but they're very, very beautiful. Okay, I'll tell you the first one. I'm not in love with the first one, but I'll tell it to you anyway. The first one, he says, why did it say eulogy first and then crying? He says, because most people, you cry first, and over time the pain is diminished. Never disappears, but the pain is diminished. Because the righteous person, because people understand her legacy and people understand the good deeds that she has done, the void is actually increases over time. Because we're in need of her good deeds, we're in need of her mitzvot, we're in need of her inspiration. So in other words, once you say eulogy, the more people understand, what's eulogy? People understand her lifestyle, people understand her values. The more the eulogy is understood, the more people understand Sarah's eulogy, the more that increases the crying, the more that increases the pain of the loss. In other words, usually the loss is natural, and then the loss is the first thing you feel. It's natural. You feel the pain, so you cry, and then you say, "Okay, we're going to learn from the deceased, and we're going to make their legacy permanent and enduring." Okay, so first you have the crying, and then you have the legacy, the eulogy. But what happens if the eulogy? The more we think about the eulogy, the more the loss is felt. And that's what Sarah happens. With Sarah, it's first the eulogy and then the pain, because the more we understand the eulogy, the more pain there is. So that's the first interpretation of the Kli Yakar. But he says something else. And here it's a little shift. Let's go back and let's look at the verse. And this goes back to the point, why does it say, and Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her? He didn't come to bewail Sarah. He came to bewail her. Eulogize of Sarah. So there's sort of this separation. Why do we put Sarah's name in the beginning? He doesn't say to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. Okay. So here, the Kli Yakar says something absolutely amazing. He says, we have to understand that when we feel the pain after someone passes, we feel the pain because we sense the separation. But ask you the question, is it painful for the soul? And does the soul feel pain? And the answer is that maybe the soul feels some degree of pain, but the also soul feels, certainly the soul of the righteous, feels a tremendous amount of joy of reuniting with Hashem. Says the Kli Yakar, just want to make sure I get this right because it's so beautiful. The eulogy is for Sarah because the eulogy helps Sarah. The eulogy is showing Sarah that her legacy is continuing in this world. So the eulogy is for Sarah. The bewailing is not for her. Sarah's not feeling the pain. When I cry, I'm not helping Sarah. I am crying for her. I am missing her, but that's my perspective. So the first thing from Abraham's perspective, first he's focusing on what he's doing for Sarah, what he's doing for his wife. And for his wife, the legacy is what's important, because then Sarah's soul feels the nachat, the joy that her legacy is going to be continued, and it's going to she'll continue to have an impact on this world because people are taking her life, taking her the legacy, taking her story and taking her legacy and making it part of their life and internalizing it. So the eulogy is for Sarah. The eulogy helps Sarah. The crying is, he's crying for her. That's because he's feeling the pain. He's feeling the void. But that's not for Sarah. That's his pain for her, missing her, but that's not on her behalf. So in other words, when the righteous for Abraham switches it because Abraham is going against the nature. Nature is what we feel first is pain. But for Sarah, from Abraham is first thing he's focusing on, what does Sarah need? Sarah needs eulogy. Sarah doesn't need the crying. Crying doesn't help her. It's not for her, it's for me. So first, Abraham has the capacity to first experience what Sarah's need, which is the eulogy, and only then does he feel his own need, which is to cry. So that's one way, and there's more to add, which I'll add in a minute. But first, that's the first step of the journey. Go ahead, Vicky.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question on how does it tie in, if anyhow, to the Midrash that what triggered Sarah's passing was witnessing on or finding out about the binding of Isaac, and
so that's not here. Does this sound like a contradiction? In other words, how do you make the connection? What do you feel?
I think that I don't know if he knew or kind of sensed what triggered Sarah's death, but maybe the fact that he's bewailing her is kind of feeling a little bit guilty and pained by that.
Okay, so you can say he feels the guilt. That's good. The problem is, there's two problems with that. First of all, then I would expect to say that the pain first, and I would expect the pain. Remember that I told you that the chaf is small, and somehow the pain was diminished. And I want to just get back to that in a second. Says other commentaries say this, that for most people, the pain is first because the pain is more pressing. But for a righteous person, the pain is actually in a sense lessened because the main thing is the legacy. The main takeaway from the passing of a righteous is their legacy, because they taught us so much. And in some sense, we're keeping their memory and legacy alive because of their great impact on so many people. So in other words, when the righteous person passes, unlike the Kli Yakar says in the first interpretation that the righteous person, what did he say? He said the pain is worse because the pain is not diminished, because the more we think about her legacy, the more we feel the void and the pain increases. And that's why it's second, because it's greater. And that would be consistent with what Vicky is saying. Because that would say that is consistent. The first interpretation of the Kli Yakar is consistent with Vicky, saying that usually the pain is diminished and you move to eulogy. The fact with Abraham's pain was not diminished. Even after the eulogy, the bewailing continues. So that's one way to read this verse. I have no problem with that way. It's a fine way. That's the first interpretation of the Kli Yakar. Others read it the other way, and it's consistent with the second interpretation of the Kli Yakar and others who say no. With the righteous person, first of all, the focus is on the eulogy. First of all, from Abraham, because that's what Sarah needs. Sarah doesn't need us to cry. It doesn't say to eulogize and cry for Sarah. Sarah doesn't need the crying. Sarah needs the eulogy, because that's how we can keep her legacy alive. And we cry for her, but she doesn't need it. And consistent with that second interpretation would be that the crying is secondary and diminished, because the more righteous the person is, the less there is to cry. What is cry? Cry is we feel disconnected. But if her legacy is alive, if she had such a great impact on so many people, right? Sarah is alive today, maybe just as much, maybe more than she was alive in her lifetime. Today, there are billions of people, at least 1 billion people, who follow her legacy. right? So in some sense, with the righteous, according to the second interpretation, no, the crying is diminished, the crying is secondary. The more impact you make on other people, the less there is to cry after their passing. So it's complex. People's emotions are complex. We have two opposite ways of reading this verse. Either the pain is diminished or the pain is increased. Which one do you like? I leave that to you. I'm not going to superimpose my own personal preferences.
It's probably mixed emotions, as we all say, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question was more about how do we know, or does anybody talk about how Abraham perceived the death and the connection of death of Sarah to binding of Isaac?
I haven't seen that explicitly in the verse, how he responds, but I do see that there is pain and there is eulogy. And I think I like the second interpretation better. I think that with the righteous, the focus is on her legacy, the eulogy. That's the focus. Lispol the Sarah, to eulogize Sarah, and then there's to mourn. In other words, the mourning, Abraham's personal pain is there, of course, but it's secondary. That's not what what he really wants to do. Is he wants to do what Sarah needs and what Sarah wants. And what does Sarah need and want? Sarah's soul wants the legacy to continue on this earth. That's what brings joy to the soul. So the legacy is what Sarah needs. The eulogy is what Sarah needs. What we need is our personal pain, so we'll deal with it. So he does that too, but it's diminished in the sense that it's secondary. It's written later and it's diminished. Now, not everybody's on Abraham's level. So for us, the natural response is what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, don't go against your nature. The first thing you're going to feel is pain. And we're not on the level of Abraham of putting the other person's need first. We feel the intense pain. And that's why the first 3 days is pain. And then we can grow to eulogy. So I think that's the Mishnah is talking about, that's human nature. And we have to allow the human nature to express itself. Otherwise, if we try to suppress it, we have other problems. We have to pay for therapy. So you need that. You need to be in tune with your own feelings. But for someone like Abraham, his personal pain was secondary and diminished. I couldn't hold myself back. I like the second interpretation better, but that's just me.
I agree. Thank you. That's what we need to take away from it.
Yeah, okay. In a sense, how would you weave them together?
He was doing it for her.
Yeah.
But as he was doing it for her,
right.
he realized what she was.
So you could say that in some sense the pain never heals. You could tie this together. You can tie them both together. I agree. He's focusing on what she needs, the eulogy. And then the more he's focused on her life, the bewailing is always there. There's always that void. So the Zohar says that joy is etched in the heart on one side and sadness in the other side. In other words, we're not people that have either happiness or sadness, right? Usually human emotion that goes together. The more you love somebody, the more longing you feel. The more you appreciate somebody, the more sadness there is after the lifetime, even though in some sense, the more the legacy is alive. So there's comfort, and the comfort doesn't take away the pain. The comfort lives together with the pain. And that's okay. That's the human soul. The human soul is capable. It's not black and white. It's not one or the other. We are complex beings. We do have complex emotions. And it could be the eulogy, which would be not a feeling of despair or void, but eulogy is a feeling of empowerment. Eulogy means it's not just to say, oh, she was a great woman, but eulogy is how can I continue her legacy in my own life? This is moving forward, right? It's not a fact of bewailing, which is almost like being first in a sense being powerless in the sense of the great loss, but it's not one or the other. We can experience both. The only question is what's the emphasis, but we can experience both. And I think that's profound. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Bob, please.
Yeah, I just was looking at these two psukim, and they're both like, those Russian dolls where there's a bigger one into a smaller one into a smaller one. I mean, they're very disjointed. It's her age of 127 years are in three different dolls, and she died in Kiryat Arba, which is in Hebron, which is in the land of Canaan. And I mean, it almost makes you feel separations in all these things.
Which is funny because the word Hebron comes from the word chibur, connection. And Kiryat Arba is the 4. So so you're right. You pointed out, I missed that. I didn't talk about the location where she died. And you're right. Then you have 3 names. Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron in the land of Canaan. In case you had no idea that Hebron is in that land of Canaan, which we said it 3 times in the last 2 portions, at least 3 times. So that's also disjointed, which means that there's messages here. There are layers of meaning. And that's what we're going to, God willing, start with next week, is try to unpack the double meaning of Kiryat Arba, Hi Hebron, in the land of Canaan. I don't remember too much about Canaan, but certainly people talk about Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron. By the way, the modern Israel, after the 6-day war, at some point, the Jewish people wanted to resettle in Hebron. And the Israeli government, even though they were allowing settlements elsewhere in Israel, they were not pro the settlement in Hebron for whatever reason. So the compromise was they made a settlement outside of Hebron called Kiryat Arba. And that was relatively large. They have hundreds of families that I remember, probably thousands by now. And only later in the early 80s did they actually have a small settlement in Hebron. So there in the Torah, it's Kiryat Arba, Hi Hebron. Kiryat Arba is Hebron. In modern Israel, you put in your GPS, Kiryat Arba and Hebron are a mile apart or whatever. So that's just a technicality. But yes, Bob is right. The years are layered, are disjointed. Disjointed means look at each one separately. Each one has its own message. And Kiryat Arba Hebron is the same, but we'll have to do that next week. In the meantime, happy Mother's Day. And if you're not the mother, at least find the mother in your life and bring her some joy. And it was wonderful to spend Mother's Day thinking about our mother. And the life of Sarah, thinking about the mother that made us who we are. So thank you. Thank you, all mothers. Thank you, Sarah. And we'll see each other in good health, God willing, next week. And we'll start thinking about the land of Israel and the land of Kiryat Arba, Hi Hebron, which is funny. Just before we start, just a teaser. Kiryat Arba is 4, the city of 4. Kiryat is city of 4. Hi Hebron is united. Chibur, connecting the 4. So you see, it's two opposite themes: connection and 4. 4 is multiplicity, but we're going to connect it all. Hopefully, the reason why I'm not saying right now the whole thing, because I confess I don't remember what is written, but I do remember that there's the connecting of the 4. So there's enough there to keep me confident that we'll be able to have something for next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Jill.
Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank
Jill.
you, Rabbi.
Everybody as well, and we'll see each other in good health. Thank you.
Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.